It is not very often that you get artists who have lasted as long as Bon Jovi has. There's a brand new Bon Jovi docu-series that is out this week, and it gives us this perfect opportunity to talk about what happens as bands age. The group chat is here. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Will you indulge me if we start right here?
Shot through the heart, and you're to blame, darling. You give love a bad name.
Listen, we had to start there. We had to start with You Give Love a Bad Name, Bon Jovi, off the 1986 album Slippery When Wet. Look, I don't think I have to tell you how big Bon Jovi is as a force. If you came up in the 80s and the 90s, you can probably name 5 Bon Jovi songs that you heard on the radio all the time or maybe watch on your TV all the time. There's a brand new documentary looking at the band's legacy. It is called Thank You, Goodnight, The Bon Jovi Story. Niko Stratis is here. Maura Johnston is here. They're with me now. Niko, Maura, are you guys ready to live on a prayer or what? Hello.
Always.
I'm halfway there.
To quote another Bon Jovi song.
I'm halfway there.
Good. We're not all the way there. We're halfway there. I love to see it. Look, there's a lot to talk about with this documentary. Niko, maybe I'll start with you. Before we get into the doc, where would you say Bon Jovi sits within your own understanding of pop, your own understanding of like the history of pop?
I mean, look, I worked in a grocery store for 4 years in the mid 1990s.
Sure.
So you just sort of like assume that JBJ, the Taylor Swift of the 1980s, is just like a foundational part of modern music. Like it's everywhere. And it's like, and it was a reference that everybody knows. If you say John Bon Jovi, nobody's like, oh, who's that? Everybody's like, oh, the Prince of New Jersey, met him, know that guy. He just is everywhere and kind of everything and is inescapable, but you were never sad to hear a John Bon Jovi song. You're like, oh yeah, I like this one.
Yeah, I'm delighted to say that we have an early Bon Jovi hater in our midst, and that her name is Maura Johnston. Maura, you had a different relationship with Bon Jovi. Do you wanna explain yourself to the people?
So I will say, I did like Runaway when it was like a single that was popping on New York radio. I grew up outside of, I grew up on the other side of New York City.
Yeah,
no,
sure.
no, I know I sound like such a jerk, but I was in 6th grade when Slippery When Wet like hit big.
Yeah.
So I had friends who had the posters of John Bon Jovi on the wall and everything, and I was like, I don't know, maybe it was like morning zoo exposure, but I was like already like, oh, we have to think about this. I was a little contrarian 12-year-old,
Yeah.
And I was such a jerk. I didn't like that my friends were into them. I thought there were, better bands out there, as if there was some sort of zero-sum thing.
Yeah.
But by the time New Jersey came around, because I actually won a cassette of New Jersey from a radio station after announcing the #1 song, which was New Kids Got Run Over by a Reindeer, by the way, if you want to talk about contrarianism. And I loved Born to Be My Baby. I thought that was just like such a great song.
Yeah.
And, I also appreciated that like John Bon Jovi, like he helped like other bands from the sort of New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, like Skid Row and Cinderella. Yeah. He helped them kind of get into, bigger places in the business. So I was fine with them. And now I'm just like, oh yeah, they kick butt.
The problem is that the hits are undeniable, and the older you get, the more you're like, oh no, they pack the hits. And we're going to talk about the hits in just a moment. But maybe it would be helpful, Niko, if we could just talk about the New Jersey of it all. You call Bon Jovi the Prince of New Jersey. Let's talk about the reputation of New Jersey, because episode 1 of this documentary takes us back into John Bon Jovi's formative years in New Jersey. This was the early 80s. What was the reputation of New Jersey in this moment? Because I don't think of New Jersey as like necessarily like a hotbed of like, this is where the best music comes out of,
Well, we say that, but Bruce Springsteen is from New Jersey.
I thought you were going to say Jack Antonoff. I understand, though. Go ahead. Yes.
Who? Never heard. But like, it was seen, and they talk about this a little bit in the doc. And of course, to talk about New Jersey, who better than someone from Toronto who grew up in the Yukon? But it's sort of like seen as this, like, it is the outskirts of New York, right? Like New York has always been, regardless of where you are, you always think of New York as like the coolest place in the world.
Sure.
And so like Jersey sort of like, at least outwardly even, and they talk about this a little bit in the doc, is like, it is a bit outskirts. It is a bit outside. It is a bit, you know, this thing of like trying to be, or like trying to be seen as this thing that is as cool and as big and as, you know, whatever as New York. And it was never kind of that, but it was always kind of close. And again, you know, like I think New Jersey has given us a lot of really great music over the years.
Yeah.
Not just Springsteen, but so many things. And they kind of go into this like almost like an incubator somewhat, but like, you know, even now, like lots of great artists from New Jersey. It is a really fantastic place. And it is just like, it has kind of become fabled over time. But at the time, definitely was like, well, it's not New York, it's New Jersey. And it's like sort of just on the outside.
Well, there's something definitional about that, Maura. This idea of New Jersey is, it's sort of like oppositional to New York. New York is where all the action is, but there's something about New Jersey and like kind of like looking into New York, but being just outside of it. And when you hear Bon Jovi in this documentary sort of explain that a little bit, and he's like, you know, he says, I looked at Led Zeppelin and I was like, I don't think I can be that. That's too big. But then here's Bruce Springsteen on the stage and he's right there and he's from this place. And seeing him here gives me this proximity. So what did you make of like the way that Bon Jovi and New Jersey were treated in that first episode?
I really appreciated it. I loved that they got Springsteen interview too. Like that's a huge get, right?
Huge get for this documentary.
Huge get. Yeah. I think that, you know, he did make New Jersey, and, you know, he and his bandmates, I should say, because it wasn't just him, even though he was the pretty face. Yeah. They made New Jersey so central to their legacy. And I do feel like they had that kind of like, you know, suburban, exurban, whatever you want to call it, outside of New York striving. Yeah. That I think, you know, made Living on a Prayer such a memorable song, that made Wanted Dead or Alive such a memorable song. There's that like hunger. And I feel like that's the kind of hunger. Like I loved how there were so many shots of going through the Lincoln Tunnel between New Jersey and New York, because that sort of crossover, as somebody who grew up on Long Island, is such a fundamental experience to living outside of New York. It's always the city. Yeah. And you position yourself opposite to that in a way, but you also, you know, that the ultimate sign of success is making it in there and like establishing a firmament for yourself in there.
So when you mentioned earlier that the idea of like Slippery and Wet, and like the fact that when it came out, this became this massive sort of like, it just basically, that's the album that made Bon Jovi explode. It gave us, you know, Living on a Prayer. You give Love a Bad Name, but it was not their first album. It was their third record. What do you think it was, Maura, about Slippery and Wet as like the album that made them sort of break through?
I think there were a couple of factors. Certainly they had been touring relentlessly since their first album came out. And then also going to Vancouver and working with producer Bruce Fairbairn, who had, you know, I think John talked about how he loved the record by a band called Black and Blue, and the way that he made it sound. And he just made it sound really massive. And then also bringing Desmond Child into the mix. And Desmond Child is like one of the great rock songwriters. He co-wrote I Was Made for Loving You by Kiss. And then he would go on to work with like Aerosmith, and, you know, he wrote with Cher. He wrote a lot of the great and late 80s Cher hits. And I think that Desmond Child's presence certainly, like, you know, he gave them the title for You Give Love a Bad Name, and they just sort of took off with it. And I think he was, you know, Sambora and Bon Jovi had like a really great kind of relationship.
That's Richie Sambora, the guitarist.
Richie Sambora, the guitarist. Yeah. I was trying to do a Lennon-McCartney thing there. But
of course.
But, you know, like, he was sort of the catalyst to take them to that next level, which, you know, he like that I think was really crucial for a lot of bands at that time. They were great musicians and they had great creative relationships, but then there would be some sort of outward factor that would sort of make them go to the next level, similar to Mutt Lange and Def Leppard.
Right. Okay, so I want to play you guys. First of all, can we just hear a second of Living on a Prayer, if you guys don't mind? We've been talking for so long, and I was like, wait a minute, we're talking about Bon Jovi. Can we just hear some of Bon Jovi, if you don't mind? Okay, so nowadays we know Bon Jovi as one of the most beloved rock bands to come out of the 80s. That is not how critics always felt about this band. Like, even when Slippery and Wet came out and became this massive hit, I want you guys to take a listen to this moment from the documentary.
We love Bon Jovi.
And at that time, as we're gaining all this fan appreciation, if you will, around the planet, we were never the critics' darling. Rolling Stone, when Slippery Wet came out, they called us a smudgy third-generation copy of Quiet Riot.
The Grammys didn't even nominate Living on a Prayer, You Give Love a Bad Name, Wanted Dead or Alive. It was hysterical and ridiculous.
But who cares? You know what I mean? With people, we're always a people's choice. And that's who you're playing for.
A smudgy third generation Quiet Riot. First of all, I want to go back and read whoever wrote that review because they had their knives out for Bon Jovi. I think that's a useful thing to talk about, though, Niko. Like that's a moment from this documentary. Thank you, Goodnight, the Bon Jovi Story. It seems kind of bonkers to me, Niko, that an album as successful as Slippery and Wet was not even nominated for a Grammy. Like, it's one thing to not be loved by critics, but it's another thing for like the establishment to also discard you in the same way. I'm curious, why did you think like critics and also the pop establishment didn't like Bon Jovi?
I mean, they kind of existed outside of two different worlds, right? Like they looked like a metal band, but they're a little bit too pop. And they kind of sounded like a pop band, but they looked a little bit too metal. And like, you think about the Grammys at the time, they're still sort of coming around to like bringing in a lot of different genres of music into the fold. And they're very much, about to be at a turning point themselves. And like, so they sort of like exist at a time. I think they talk a lot in the doc, and they sort of reference in there is they were a band of the people, right? They were their early manager said, like we go out and we bring ourselves to the fans. We don't ask the fans to come to us. And they were very much like, there is a lot of fan service in Bon Jovi insofar that they really sort of did their work to connect with people wherever they went. And they were so much more about the fans and that sort of thing than they were the critics or what have you.
Yeah.
Which sort of like, I feel like we see shades of it in the modern era when we see, Bon Jovi in his 60s talking about his relationship to critics and versus fans and all that. But, they kind of didn't really live in a place like that. They sort of carved their own path of being, both pop and metal at the exact same time.
You know what that reminds me of, Maura, is like the thing that comes to mind out of all things is Shania Twain. And the reason Shania comes to mind is because when Shania came out, the country music establishment was like, this isn't country. We're not interested. Get it out of here. And sort of critics kind of bristled a little bit at the notion that you would use Def Leppard drums to actually create country music. So there's something transgressive about actually stealing the pop moment for yourself, like Bon Jovi did, like Shania Twain did. But that doesn't mean the critics are always going to love that kind of treatment, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I also think that there was just like kind of a bias against, even though, Quiet Riot is favorably compared to Bon Jovi. I think that there was definitely a bias against the type of music that they were doing. I think part of it was kind of rooted in like MTV era bias of like being suspicious of anyone who was too pretty. You saw it with Duran Duran too, who like, were making great records. And I think it was like what Niko talked about with like them kind of being too metal for pop, too pop for metal. Also, them being kind of these strivers, which I feel like rock criticism at the time kind of looked down on that in a way for new bands. And then just also them being really, like we talked about, like, fan servicey, ready to do anything. They didn't have that kind of remove or aloofness that made them seem cool. Yeah. Even though a lot of people thought that they were cool, the people who were kind of arbiters of whether or not someone was cool were like, you try too hard. I think that that's kind of a big factor.
When you say strivers, I go back to what Niko said earlier, which is calling Bon Jovi the Taylor Swift of the 80s, because like that is certainly a similar kind of relationship when it comes to an artist who's like, yeah, I would really like to be this big, and then the establishment, at least at first, becoming a little bit skeptical of that approach. Niko, I want to get back to this documentary. There's a moment in the doc where you hear Bon Jovi talking about touring in his 60s, struggling with his voice. You hear there's this smash sort of montage of all the different therapies and treatments that he has to get in order to be able to sing. And even still, it doesn't really necessarily look like he might be able to. You hear him say, "I don't need to do this. I want to do this," which, funny enough, reminds me of the J-Lo movie and documentary that came out a couple of months ago, because I think she expressed basically the same sentiment. What do you make of this sentiment from acts who are maybe not in the sort of the highest point of their career, sort of coming out saying, "I don't need to be here, but I really want to be"? What's your relationship to that sentiment when it comes out?
I mean, there's a real drive and desire in him, and when we given the context of how he built his career, you really sort of see that. And also, like, I think it is a really interesting thing, talking about him and J-Lo in particular, in the face of like a lot of rock documentaries right now are about younger artists. Like we saw Taylor Swift one, we saw all these things, but like JBJ's in his 60s, right? And he's very much like he talks about being in his 60s. He talks about being older, his voice, because he had, he struggled with his voice after having COVID and all these things. And like he talks a lot about legacy, and he talks a lot about he doesn't want to be seen as anything other than the sort of vision of himself, and he needs to do this because it is like a validation, and it is a validation of everything that he's worked so hard for so many years. Yeah. And he doesn't want to be less than this sort of like the person that he worked really hard to become. And, that must be a really difficult thing. I think it's a really interesting thing to watch older people be given a chance to be vulnerable, be strong at the exact same time. And I thought that was really striking.
Yeah, Maura, we got maybe like 30 seconds left here. How do you feel about the way that his legacy, John Bon Jovi's legacy, was treated in this documentary?
I think his legacy and the band's were treated much more honest than might be in a normal self-produced doc. Certainly having Richie Sambora on board, brought that kind of extra heat to the honesty, and just kind of talked about how, people did confuse John Bon Jovi, the soloist, with Bon Jovi, the band. And I think that presence added a kind of frankness to the proceedings. It wasn't like, warts and all, obviously, but it was more nuanced about the band's trajectory than maybe a puff piece might be.
There is always, to me, a reward in not having the artist be involved as a producer, because what you end up getting is just a little bit more honest, and people engage with it just a little bit more honestly than that. Niko, Maura, I appreciate your time. That's the time we got. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
You guys are the best. Thank you. Niko Stratis is a culture critic who writes the newsletter Anxiety Shark from Toronto. Maura Johnston is a freelance music journalist based out of Boston. And you can watch that documentary, Thank You, Goodnight, the Bon Jovi Story, right now on Disney+. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I genuinely think there is no digital space that knows me as well as my TikTok knows me. Like, the app is so good at figuring out exactly the thing that I actually want, that I'm looking for in that moment. And it just kind of, that's the thing that TikTok has become known for. But TikTok is also more than just a fun place to watch delightful videos. It's become an important place for community. It's become an important place for people to actually find each other. You may have seen the headlines this week that the U.S. President Joe Biden signed a so-called TikTok ban recently. What exactly is going on in that, and what does that mean for the future of the app? To talk about all of this, we have Ana Diaz. She's a culture writer with Polygon. Ana, welcome to the show.
Hi, Elamin. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Look, if you met someone at a party and they were like, Ana, help me understand what is happening with this TikTok ban, how would you explain it to them?
Yeah, you're going to get an idea of how fun I am at parties. But basically, we have TikTok, the massively popular video sharing app. And TikTok is owned by a China-based company called ByteDance. Yeah. So basically now the US government wants to force its parent company, ByteDance, to divest from the app because they say it's a national security threat to Americans. And these policymakers say it's a threat because ByteDance is based in China. And so basically, the idea is that, ByteDance could or does share user information, like the user information on millions of Americans with the Chinese government. Right. Yeah.
But what does that mean? Because I guess you hear the idea of, okay, this could be considered a national security threat. And I go, I am just scrolling, watching silly videos on here. And then you get this idea the U.S. government doesn't want user data to be collected by China. Why is that? What could go wrong from that front?
Yeah. So, like every other popular social media platform, TikTok collects a lot of data on its users. And so it uses an algorithm that determines what video each person sees on the app, and it collects data to kind of tailor that algorithm. So, TikTok has information on how long you watch videos, the kinds of videos that you watch, what kinds of videos that you like, the people you follow, the different content categories of the people that you follow. Sure. And it records a ton of information on every person's interaction with content in the app. So in this way, the app can collect a lot of user data. And so the argument posed by some conservative lawmakers is that this data could be used to manipulate the American public and essentially like influence the elections or, have other kind of negative impacts.
So the U.S. wants ByteDance to sell TikTok, and TikTok CEO Shou Chew responded with a TikTok, of course.
TikTok gives everyday Americans a powerful way to be seen and heard, and that's why so many people have made TikTok part of their daily lives. Rest assured, we aren't going anywhere. We are confident and we will keep fighting for your rights in the courts. The facts and the Constitution are on our side, and we expect to prevail again.
Now, that's what you'd expect the CEO of TikTok to say, like, hey, we're not going to go anywhere. Don't worry about anything happening here. But with the showdown coming up, how do you think it's going to play out?
Yeah, so, as, that video confirmed, the company plans to challenge the law in court. Yeah. And it's entirely likely that these legal challenges could stretch out far longer than the allotted 270 days. As of now, the new law signed into effect gives ByteDance 270 days to divest from the company. Yeah. And as for particular legal arguments, well, people are already saying that this is a First Amendment rights issue and that the ban would be a violation of free speech. So I spoke to a TikTok expert with a legal background, and in her mind, she said that it might not be a slam dunk legal argument, but it's certainly a First Rights Amendment issue. The First Amendment does apply to social media, and it's also an obvious case to make. And you can already see it becoming a popular argument among like everyday users on the app. So It's a legal argument, but also kind of like a rallying point for its users.
I was going to say, like, it seems like a very powerful tool for TikTok to enlist its user base in this fight because so many people use the app every day. I want to play a thought experiment for a moment. Okay, so you are a buyer for TikTok. You're Microsoft, Ana, and you're thinking, maybe I want to buy this app. TikTok's algorithm is a part of China's export control list. That means that China would have to give the green light to sell this technology. That seems unlikely. So if you're the buyer and you're interested in it, what's in it for you if you're just buying TikTok, but without the algorithm because China won't sell that?
Yeah, so your question definitely touched on this. TikTok's algorithm is a main draw of the app. And so there is that looming question of what its value is. The algorithm is extremely effective in connecting niche audiences and helping people find content online and create community. You can, have a small following and go viral for, giving helpful advice because that's how effective this algorithm is. Yeah. So not having the algorithm would be a pretty big deal since, that's what allows that to happen. However, even TikTok's algorithm is constantly changing in ways we don't always know. And so while not having it would definitely change the app, and it might feel like something loosely between the difference of like Twitter and X now, maybe not so extreme, but I think that's like it's one way that we've observed social media kind of change. Sure. There's still a massive value there. There's a massive active audience there, and the content that's there is of big value. So, and also another company can come up with its own algorithm. It might not be the proprietary TikTok algorithm, but there's still, a massive amount of value there.
Right. It's just a sizable audience, even if, you don't get served videos maybe exactly in the same way.
Exactly.
You spoke with some of the biggest creators on TikTok, about how they're feeling about what's going on right now. What did they tell you about how they're feeling?
Yeah. So, when people think about who will be impacted by the ban, they usually think about, the viral influencers with millions of followers who are like raking in brand deals. And this will definitely impact those people. And that impact is, important. Yeah. But part of what my reporting showed was like, it's important to think about the other kinds of ways that this could influence other kinds of creators on the platform. There are people who rely on income from several different social media platforms at once, but then TikTok is the main way that they reach these new viewers. And so losing TikTok would also hurt their other social media platforms and their ability to make money, even if they're not like the biggest TikTok, influencer in the world. And one other expert I spoke to emphasized that even if a person doesn't lose all their income from TikTok, it can still have a really big impact. So you might be a person who works a full-time job, but, relies on TikTok for some extra cash. So like, for example, you might be a barista who makes videos about your favorite video game after hours and say, your videos kind of consistently perform decently well and make you $100 or so a month from TikTok. Like, sure. That's not boatloads of cash. But it's meaning
significant income, right? It's still, it can make a difference in your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Ana, I've got to leave it there, but I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you shedding light on this. We are not going to be done with the story anytime soon, so thank you so much for being here to explain it.
No, thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Ana Diaz is a culture writer with Polygon. She was in Chicago, and she's speaking about the future of TikTok. Listen, that is it for the show today. We are going to be back tomorrow. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. See you tomorrow.